Take it away, Kevin.
Thanks, Nina. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another great AIM webinar, this time with our friends from Access Corp. It's a great subject because, look, in the most recent AIM State of the Industry survey, compliance and risk were key drivers in influencing information governance in organizations. Staying compliant with regulations and laws in today's rapidly changing regulatory landscape, of course, is a critical challenge, and it can be difficult to keep up and ensure ongoing compliance with the vast amounts of information that we must manage every day. But what about also the success of the organization and how we leverage that information in ways that matter in terms of building a success for the organization, improving organizational performance, meeting the needs of customer experience, and so forth? So today we will explore the role of information governance in navigating compliance and offer some practical strategies also for using information governance as a way to move the business forward in ways that matter. We'll discuss the challenges that organizations face when it comes to compliance and share some best practices for effective information management. So with that, let's bring on our guests today, starting with Ian McPherson. Ian, are you with us?
I am with you. Hello, Kevin. Thanks
Hello,
for having me
Ian.
here
It is
today.
great to have you with us today. Ian is the business development executive with Access Corp. Ian, where are you calling in from?
I am calling in from Calgary, Alberta.
Nice. I would love to get up to Calgary. Perhaps we'll get together up there. I would love to have an excuse to visit. So thank you for being with us. Also with us today is Omero Banuelos. Omero, are you with us?
I am. How you doing?
Hello, Omero. Omero is senior counsel with Access Corp. Where are you calling in from, Omero?
I'm calling from Southern California.
Nice. Southern California, a place I know well and wish I was in right now.
It's kind of gloomy
Well,
right
welcome
now.
aboard, Ian and Omero. Thank you so much for being a part of our event today. I'd like to start with you, Ian, if I could today. Access recently conducted a survey of records and information management professionals to see how the industry is changing and where records information management is headed in 2023. The survey asked about respondents' goals, how they measure their success, the challenges they face, and where their plans are to invest over the next 12 months. Survey respondents said that digitizing physical records is really still their top priority, even after decades of digital transformation since it was first introduced. Why do you feel organizations are still struggling or still addressing paper and physical records?
It's a great question, Kevin, and I think there are a number of different factors impacting that. The first thing I like to say is that the digital transformation it's not just a technology issue. It's more of a change management challenge, right? A change management event. And in some cases where there is an event that can help drive some of those changes and those transformations, it becomes a lot easier to implement. So, if a company is going through a merger or an acquisition, or they're looking to address some of their real estate challenges, it can really help drive that change management within an organization. If we don't have those events, changing for the sake of change, it can be a challenge. And particularly when we look at digitizing records and those digital transformation initiatives, we recognize that it takes people, it takes technology, it takes a huge focus on compliance in order for those efforts to be effective. And when the organizations are looking at embarking on those type of initiatives, we always encourage them to first and foremost have your policies and procedures in place. The records that you have, be able to apply those policies and procedures to your collections. And that will help in a number of different ways. That will help, you really understand the content that first and foremost might be eligible for destruction, but also it can help you determine, potentially based on retention requirements, future retention needs, what content is best just left in storage, or where some of those records might be a candidate for digitization. And then when we're looking at digitization, really understanding some of those regulatory compliance rules and retention rules around those contents can help drive some of the decisions around how you're going to image that content. And what I mean by that is, are we just going to scan everything at once because it's so active and the retention policies dictate it's worth scanning everything at once? Or are there maybe some other approaches we take where we only scan the content as needed, as it's needed? But, as we look at those initiatives, we need to understand also how that content is going to be accessed and managed moving forward. That is imperative in driving decisions around things like, what naming conventions we need, what sources of metadata we need to capture, so that we can really facilitate not only the access to that content, but also the information management lifecycle of those records. One of the things that we saw a lot during COVID were companies that were doing what we call a lot of convenience scanning, right? They needed a copy of a record, people were at home, they quickly scan something, send it out. And they're not necessarily creating content that meets the regulatory requirements, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in or the country that you're in, to be able to uphold those records as a source of truth. So when you are looking at digitizing, you need to look at all those factors, including, are we creating compliant copies that we can uphold as a source of truth? And do we have a plan in place to actually manage that life cycle and ensure that we protect the investment that we've put into creating digital records, and that we're prepared to manage that life cycle? And, I think if we're looking at all those different areas holistically, we'll have success. Unfortunately, if we're not looking holistically and we're just diving in and starting to scan content, that's where organizations have a lot of challenges. And that's where things maybe don't go as quickly or as smoothly as planned.
Now, Omero, when it comes to digitization today, everyone is talking about and thinking about AI and generative bots. It was a hot topic at AIIM 23. And the Access report also found that organizations are increasingly looking to AI and technology to meet their records and information management demands. Specifically, how is AI being used for information governance?
I think now, from what at least what I've seen, and what I kind of envision is you're going to look at AI more as a tool to help you identify the information you're retaining and the data and records, right? And potentially classify that, right, and assign your retention requirements to those either records, information, or data. So a lot of that, those tools, I think, are going towards that that goal of identifying what the organization is actually retaining or keeping, and then finding how you're going to manage that information or that data, right? So you got so many regulations now that require you to at least identify what you're keeping, destroy certain records in terms of privacy. So I think the AI tools are really going to assist you on really identifying what you're retaining and classifying that information in a way that you can manage it.
There are so many regulations today, and in fact, changing all the time. Changing regulations and privacy considerations are always placing new demands on organizations. And for example, the newly established National Archives and Records Administration guidelines that support federal agencies transitioning to fully electronic record keeping, but there are many others. What are some best practices to stay in compliance today with the changing regulatory landscape?
Well, I think definitely reviewing your policies regularly and updating those, your retention schedule specifically on a regular basis, whether it's annual or quarterly or even biannual. There has to be some mechanism for you to identify those new regulations and adjust your policies accordingly. And with AI specifically, you're going to see the European Union's coming out with AI regulations now, and they're pretty much bolstering what the current privacy GDPR regulations are. They're identifying certain systems that are sensitive, and you're going to have to adjust to those requirements as well. I mean, California, with their new privacy regulation, their adjustments are they're basically adopting a scheme similar to HIPAA, where you're responsible for your vendors, right? If you're familiar with HIPAA, you have these business associate agreements that you have to have with vendors. California is adopting a very similar method of liability, where you have to ensure your vendors are in compliance with the privacy regulations, and if they're not, you're liable. So, identifying those risks and those new regulations is important so you can update your policies and your procedures so you can react to that.
Now, Ian, we've been talking about compliance, but what about the other side of the coin? What is your view of information management beyond compliance? How can and does information governance drive business success in terms of things like competitive advantage, organizational performance, and revenue generation?
Great point. And I think, before I touch on that, one of the things that I'll say is that, having all those policies and procedures in place, and as Omero said, making sure that you're constantly updating things like your retention schedule, that's paramount. But being able to actually apply those policies and procedures to your collection can be somewhat of a challenge. So, you want to be mindful of the fact that, in order to, for example, apply your retention schedules, you want to be making sure that you're tracking your content in a way that you can apply those retention test schedules and do that disposition as needed. And then when you're looking at things like managing electronic records, are you creating them to the standard that's required? Do you have the audit trails in place? Can you accurately say that that's the source of truth? But the benefits of being able to do that are fantastic. I mean, right off the bat, you have the cost benefits of having those plans in place. So many of our partners these days are really looking to reduce their costs associated with storing records. So right off the bat, having those policies and procedures in place and being set up so that you can execute things like your disposition processes are going to save you money. And right off the bat, in terms of being able to manage some of those storage costs associated with physical records, and also start planning for some of those disposition efforts that might be ongoing throughout your organization. In terms of other competitive advantages, being able to make informed decisions around how you're accessing that content, how you're managing that content. For example, if you're looking at potential candidates for digitization within your organization, knowing what records you, for whatever reason, must maintain physically versus electronically can help guide those discussions or those decisions and help make you make really informed decisions that have a return on investment when you're moving forward. The other benefit, of course, is operational effectiveness. Being able to access your information quickly and being confident that you've got the most accurate, up-to-date version of that record can really help with that decision-making process and really help organizations move quickly when they need to in various areas. And you asked me, Kevin, where I was based, and I'm in Calgary, Alberta. I deal with a tremendous amount of oil and gas companies, and those organizations that have gone digital in a compliant way are really seeing the benefit of that, not only in making decisions and having quick access to information when they need it, particularly for their workers in the field, but also when it comes to things like mergers and acquisitions. We've worked with some local associations here and have some great success stories where our partners can say, hey, because we've got everything managed electronically and we're doing it in a compliant manner, we can manage that transition of records in a matter of days, where it used to take us months to transfer those records. And for a company looking to acquire assets, knowing that they can very quickly obtain source of truth records electronically and be able to be up and running on those newly acquired assets in a matter of days versus months is a huge competitive advantage. And we're even seeing organizations that are looking to divest and recognizing that they might have some challenges in that area and trying to get ahead of the game, right? And trying to address some of those issues so they become more attractive to potential buyers. So the benefits are just immense. So cost benefits, operational effectiveness benefits, and then of course just being cutting edge and being an industry leader in your organization, in your industry, is very important for a lot of people, and compliance is certainly kind of top of that list for many of them.
We are here today with Ian McPherson, Business Development Executive with Access Corp, and Omero Banuelos, Senior Counsel at Access, and we're talking about information governance, compliance, organizational performance. Now, gentlemen, with all of these factors in mind, what should a modern information governance policy really look like? What are some specific elements that should be included in my plan?
Well, from my point of view, it starts with your retention schedule, right? So you need to identify what you're retaining, what you're keeping, and categorize that so you can assign some appropriate guidance around the retention and disposition of that record. I think also because of AI and the ability of organizations now to actually categorize, I think, and classify the data they're keeping and the information they're keeping, not just records, that you're going to see these retention schedules actually capture that information as well, right? Because now you could, with the help of AI, I believe you're going to be able to auto classify that, eventually identify that, and assign at least a business need to it, so that you're complying with privacy regulations, AI regulations that are coming, and cybersecurity regulations, all those items that need to be considered. So I think for me, at least, starts with a retention schedule, and I think the retention schedules, at least in my opinion, are going to be expanded to cover information and data that's being retained, and that's going to be, I think, the easier going forward with the help of some AI tools that can at least help you identify what you have. I think one of the challenges is, like Ian mentioned earlier, you can have this fancy retention schedule, right? But unless you could actually apply it and train people on it, it's going to be very difficult to enforce. But I think as you actually identify actual records, usually our retention schedules, you have a kind of a big bucket with specific items and records listed, examples. I really being detailed and specific in those examples really help the user know, so that there's no gray areas in terms of enforcement. Sometimes organizations call a record or information by different names within departments, right? So developing some consistency and identifying what you're actually keeping is really going to help. So I think it all starts with your retention schedule and your disposition policies.
Now, can you give us an example of one organization or one use case that you feel has been particularly successful? What did they do and what were the results?
Yeah, maybe I'll start that off. I can give you a great example of a client that I work with. There happen to be an energy client, as most of my clients are here in Calgary. But this organization came to us with a mandate. They were mandated to significantly reduce the amount of physical records that they had in storage, and to start looking at enhancing their ongoing digitization efforts to address some of that content that was in storage. So the first thing that we identified was that we needed to have updated retention policies. To Omero's point, if we're looking at destroying content, we want to do that, ensuring that we're making the right decisions on that content. So the first step was we needed to work with them to update their retention policy. The next challenge we had then was applying that updated retention policy to their large collection of records that they were holding in storage. So that became a fairly heavy lift on its own, where we literally had to go through and help the client go through all of their indexing. And luckily, this client had the majority of their content indexed at the file level. So when we talk about being able to set yourself up for success, the fact that they already had their content or most of their content indexed at the file level, we were able to take that retention schedule, look at their holdings, and identify content that was eligible for destruction, not only right now, but also to forecast out over the next few years what content was going to be eligible for destruction. And then we also, had some content that was left over that that did require a little bit more investigation, and obviously over time, some of those best practices around tracking the content at the file level, they weren't 100% over the years with that. So we did have some content that we had to go back and take a look at. But going through that exercise enabled them to confidently identify a large amount of content that was eligible for destruction and forecast out what their disposition was going to look like over the next few years. And for this particular client, it was actually almost 60% of their holdings were eligible for destruction, which was huge. And when you think about that, if they were looking at jumping in and digitizing all of that content, they would have potentially digitized 100% of that content when 60% of it was eligible for destruction right off the bat. So, huge cost savings there. And then once that effort is completed, then we have the remaining content that's left over, and we have to make the decisions around what's best for that content. And some of it, depending on the retention schedule, if we know that it's going to be destroyed in a few years, there again might not be a point in digitizing it. So maybe we put a plan in place where we can scan that content if it's requested, if it's needed. Otherwise, it's going to remain in storage until their retention period is up, and we can destroy that. Whereas other components of their collections were a prime candidate for upfront digitization. There was a return on investment for doing that. Their operational needs dictated that some of that collection, be digitized right up front. So what I like about this example is, I think most organizations have a similar mandate. We don't want to pay to store content we don't need to store. We want to reduce our holdings. We want to make decisions in an informed way that are compliant, and we want to plan for moving forward so that if we are going to embark on a digital transformation, that we're doing it in a cost-effective approach, in a way that we're meeting all the compliance standards and requirements, and we have a plan in place for managing those newly created electronic records in a compliant manner so we can manage the life cycle. And it was a very, very successful initiative that ultimately we were able to meet the client goals, and we're assured that we did it in a compliant manner.
All right, we are here with
you have a few
Ian and Merrill from Access Corp. If you have any questions for our guests today, please, now would be the time to start entering them into the Q&A feature. We'll try to get to some of your questions here in a moment in the remaining time that we have left. I'm sorry, Merrill, I think I cut you off. Were you going to make a comment?
No, I was just going to say I agree with Ian. I mean, my examples will be similar. From clients, I think we've had clients successfully start identifying data and information in their schedule and assigning disposition requirements and retention periods to those, just to identify what you're actually keeping. Is there a business need to keep this? How long is it to ensure you're complying with privacy regulations, especially? The other part is just using, your regulatory research to actually get a justification from the business, right? To move away from like a permanent or indefinite retention to ask for a justification of what really is the business need for records. That, we've had a lot of organizations that have more of a conservative approach where they kept things permanently, and it's not necessarily an organization decision. It's kind of a department decision to keep things forever. And so trying to convince those departments, you do need some basis to approach them, right? So if the regulations are saying, hey, as long as you have to keep these 10 years, why are we keeping it permanent? At least that triggers a discussion to start moving away from that permanent retention. And the second part of that is also identifying the records. We've had clients that we've been able to really hone in and identify what records they actually have to keep physically, whether because there's a business need or a risk need there for maybe litigation to keep the physical original record, or which records can they actually digitize, right? So that's an important part as well. And that answer is not always clear, but it is not an easy process, but it's one that definitely is beneficial.
All right, gentlemen, what are some next steps with all of this? Help me out. What are some next steps? How does Access help with this? And is there a resource or some next steps that you can recommend to us?
You want to take that one first, or
Sure.
no? I can go.
Yeah, the great thing about Access is, we do have services and solutions that can help in all areas. Amaro and his team can really help go in and do some risk assessments and determine where the organization is at in their development of their information management program, and certainly provide services around updating those retention schedules and services that we have around maintaining those schedules, keeping them up to date, doing all that research for you, making sure that your policy is accurate based on your industry and your needs. In addition to that, we have so services that can support doing some of that business analytical work and in identifying the content that's actually eligible for disposition, and helping with some of that decision making. And of course, we have a lot of services around digitization, and we can support that in many different ways. But first and foremost, it's understanding where you're at, what your immediate need is, and what's needed to kind of get you started on that journey, so that you're doing it in a compliant way.
Yeah, I agree with that, Ian. And I think just like you said, we definitely assist in keeping your policies up to date and compliance with the regulatory guidelines. And part of that is also making sure the schedule is actually presented in a fashion that you can actually train the user and make it user friendly, right? So part of it is, if we have a very complex schedule or complex policies, it's just going to be unenforceable and kind of a waste of time. So unless you can make sure the business is buying in and the users are able to understand the schedule and provide actual feedback and have input in the schedule, it's going to be really hard to train the users. So I think we've been very effective in assisting clients and creating policies, retention schedules, and other items in a format that encourages participation from your departments and your business units and the users.
All right, Ian and Omero, I would like to open it up now for questions from our audience. Some Q&A would be great. If you have any questions for our guests today, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A feature. We'll get them into the flow of the show. Omero, you made a good point, though, about a policy is only as good as how well people follow it and manage it. And our listeners often tell us that one of their biggest hurdles when it comes to these types of things is getting the type of buy-in and adoption that they need. How can our listeners increase adoption and buy-in of these policies, procedures, and systems for information governance?
Well, at least from my experience, I was in-house counsel, so I've kind of felt that pain of trying to get people to listen, right? But I think it's really fact sensitive by organization, but really you just need, usually there's an event that triggers it, right? Or there's a department or a need that identifies the concern, and that you kind of could leverage that, right? In our case, when I was in-house, is a lot of our changes were driven by litigation and concerns and costs, right? So I think you just have to identify an area that's a concern, partner up with someone in the organization that's kind of going through the same pain points as you are to really kind of identify value. And I'll give you a specific example. We made a lot of changes because I was in-house and I could see the vendor bills and invoices for e-discovery, right? And when you get a subpoena from the SEC or any government agency or litigation, you have to go through all your backup tapes, every hard drive you have, every information you have, paper or digitized, and you have to scrub it and make sure that you're producing relevant information. That's very expensive. So if you don't have a way to manage that or get rid of information, you're going to have to go through it. So it's super expensive. So I was able to, use that opportunity to make significant changes in our policies and the way we kept things. Also, I was mentioning to Ian the other day, I was in litigations before, and if you don't have effective policies and procedures and where you're retaining things and where you're keeping it, one of the worst things, you're in a deposition and an employee says, oh yeah, I actually do have a copy of that record that you thought was destroyed, and they're keeping it on their phone or their personal laptop, right? And it's kind of one embarrassing because you already said, like, we turned everything over, but now it looks like you're hiding things, right? So those kind of things really are opportunities for change. And you know, again, it's those are specific to my experience, but I think you need something like that to really show value in investing money in this, because it's not, you know, it's not something that's going to generate sales, but it's going to save money.
Well, we do have some questions coming in from our participants today. Thank you. This one from Lilibeth. Thank you, Lilibeth, for your comment and question today. And Lilibeth asks, can Access identify a case in Latin America or the Caribbean that can serve as a successful digitization case study? What were some of the challenges? Do you have something from those regions that we can talk about?
You know, it's a great question. We do actually have significant access services that we provide in Latin America. Unfortunately, I'm not overly you know, up to speed on the specific projects that they've worked on there. But we could certainly, if you want to make sure we get your information and reach out, we can put you in touch with our team members who are specifically responsible for delivering those services in Latin America. I'm sure they'd be happy to share some of their experiences with you.
And I see in the background, the little AIM gremlins are telling me that we're already working on making that connection. Very good. This one coming in from Sharon. Sharon, thank you. When you consulted to the company who was responsible for identifying the records, I'm not quite sure if I'm getting this right, and were there limited resources to do the manual review? Tell us about that. What happens when you have limited resources to do a manual review? Are there other tools that can help automate that process?
There are some tools. It really comes down to the information that you have, what level of indexing you currently have in place on the files that you're trying to review, or potentially what information would need to be captured in order to accurately do that review. In terms of the manual effort, I'm so glad you asked that question. We've done a few projects recently. One with a national law firm in Canada, had offices right across Canada. They were having significant challenges just physically doing the work, right? They had an up-to-date retention schedule, and we had worked with them on that. And they had been trying for years to actually go through all their inventory holdings across the country and actually identify the content that was eligible. And we weren't talking about necessarily going in and pulling content out of storage. We were talking about physically going through their list, seeing what was indexed, and actually applying their retention schedule to it. And their feedback to us was, hey, we know we can do this internally. It's just we never get to it, and it's been years. Can you help? So sometimes it's not a matter of, you know, we have any secret ability that you don't have, but we do have the experts who are familiar with various different file types, who do this day in, day out, and can take some of those project efforts that might take months or years. We can do that in a much tighter time period for you. In some cases, our clients do want to do some of that manual review of the content as well. I think I mentioned when I was talking about the case study that, you know, for a large amount of the content, we were able to very confidently say this content is eligible for destruction. But there usually is some content where we're not sure, or there's some information that's lacking. And in those situations, we can accommodate that in a couple of different ways. We can, you know, have our people who are familiar with file types from all kinds of different industries, but we would also take our guidance from yourselves to kind of train us on what your specific requirements are. We can do some of that work for you, or you could literally come in, do some of that analysis yourself, and flag what's eligible for disposition and go from there. But It really does come down to that manual effort that's involved. How can we get that done, most effectively for you? And in some cases, yes, if we don't have that indexing in place, we will look at, can we do this manually, or can we leverage some of our tools to gather some of that information that we need right from the files itself, using some of our scanning technology to help automate that process for you.
This
Hopefully
next
that answers the
coming
question.
in
Okay.
from, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully that was the type of information that that the person who asked the question was looking for.
I hope so. And of course, we'll try to put everyone together for follow-up as needed. This next question coming from Angela. Thank you, Angela. Why would a company have to go through backup tapes? These should only be used for disaster recovery. Does this occur often? That's an interesting question. What about backups for disaster recovery?
Well, when you have, say, a discovery request subpoena, you're supposed to look through all your information to produce relevant information. So if you have whatever information you have, if you have access to it, your duty is to go through those tapes and see if there's anything different, or maybe there's legacy information in there that's been retired. So your duty as when you're producing records for discovery, and this is not really kind of retention requirements, it's more just responding to litigation requests or discovery requests or demand in litigation, but you have to represent to the agency or the other party that you've looked through all your records and your information and your hard drives to produce any relevant information. So it could be that that's all backup information is duplicative. It could be that maybe it has additional information that was currently deleted. So you have to do an effort. So if you ever talk to an e-discovery provider, they can probably give you the details they go through in looking at these tapes, but you will have some certain obligation, legal obligation, to at least say, look, we reviewed it, we know what's in there, and it's no longer relevant. So sometimes you could say definitely that that's just straight backup and it's a duplicate of what you already produced, and sometimes you can't. So it just depends on your IT department and how you're holding things. But it's it's more of a representation that you've you made your best efforts in good faith to produce records, and that it's not in some other drive or a tape somewhere or a personal drive in the company.
Abdul is asking about, well, Mason, excuse me, both really asking about AI. Specifically, Mason is asking about the using AI for risk assessments. What is our experience using AI in the area of risk assessment?
I think for me, I haven't really personally seen AI. I haven't observed it or being used for that, but I think it definitely has potential for that, right? I mean, it does definitely have I think the potential to assist you with risk assessment and at least identifying gaps in the system. So I do think that it's we're talking about the issue of the manual process of reviewing things, right? AI is one of those things that's going to definitely help you carry the load in terms of a manual review. It's going to so I think because of that, it's going to be able to identify a lot of gaps in what you're actually keeping and what you're not, and whether or not you're consistently applying that policy or practice to that record. So I'm not aware of anything specifically that's using AI for risk assessment, but I could definitely see it being a handy tool. I think it's going to be more efficient. Human error is a thing, right? I'm sure AI is going to make mistakes, but I think if you compare human error and AI, at some point AI is going to be more effective.
Mero and Ian, it's been great speaking with you today. We're running short of time, but before I let you go, I have another question for you, and it has to do with the management and governance of new media. For example, I was speaking with one practitioner not long ago in a city government, county government, I forget, but the idea being that they were used to scanning and digitizing paper records. They had some policies in place and some systems in place for digital records, but more and more they were being asked to archive and save police body cam footage, in video footage. And it really fell outside sort of the scope of what their paradigm was about. And they had these large video files. They had a lot of storage that was associated with it. They didn't know how long really to keep it or what to do with it. When it comes to all of this, what about those new media files that organizations now are being asked to become part of their information governance? How do those roll up into all of these policies and retention strategies that we've been talking about?
Well, from my point of view, that's going to be, I'm assuming they're keeping that based on a business need or risk, right? Liability risk and potential issues they have. So that would be a record that would be identified in your retention schedule, the surveillance, and you would be assigning an amount of time that you're going to keep those. Is it permanent? Is it in 10 years? Are you going to go back? How far are you actually going to go back on these cams, right? When you're going to have some liability issues, and I'm assuming that's driving it. So a lot of this is going to come from local experience, and I think we had a question about Latin America, Caribbean. We do research in all those countries, so we have research regarding retention, but a lot of the small countries don't have, they're not up to date in terms of electronic records or digitizing. So you're not going to, sometimes there's not going to be a clear-cut answer. So a lot of it's going to be local custom, like you just mentioned. There's a local, county police department. We've had experience where there's no regulation, but the local tax agency from, let's say, I don't know, Philippines or Guatemala or somewhere will say, you have to keep the physical records. We want the physical records. And that's just a common practice in that locality. All right. So those are things that you have to account for. And those are mostly based just on risk and personal, issues that you have there. So some of that is taking the customer practice and the reality of the situation into consideration.
If it's me, I might just keep everything. Is there a risk to just keeping everything? Always?
Yeah, well, definitely. One, you're going to have privacy issues, right, with the regulation and now with the AI. So there's definitely a pressure in terms of getting rid of information, and also liability, right? You may not want information there forever. When you're producing records, again, this all goes to discovery and producing records and litigation. Do you want those records around? Because if you have them, there may be some email or something there, or a record, a research record that's not favorable to your position, and you may or may not want it, right?
All right. Well, I would like to thank Homero Banuelos and Ian McPherson for being with us today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of our event and for your great comments and perspective today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.
All right. And
Yeah.
with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Nina. Nina, you've got some news on what I think is going to be a great mega webinar coming up on information management in the age of AI. Tell us more about that.
Yes, so artificial intelligence has been around for some time, yet people often feel like, it's not needed for what they do, or that's an IT issue to deal with. Well, not anymore, because in the last few months, generative AI has exploded thanks to the launch of ChatGPT. So join us on July 26th with a lineup of industry experts as we discuss and explore the impact AI has and will continue to have on information management. Remember, you don't need to worry about what AI is, but you do need to understand what it does and what it can do. So click the link in the chat today to register. And as we bring this webinar to a close, just the last few minute reminders. We've recorded this webinar, so you can catch anything you want to hear again in a recap email that will be sent to you within 24 hours. We also have a feedback survey at the end of this call, so feel free to fill that out for us and let us know how we did. And before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask Ian and Homero if they have any key takeaways for our audience today. Any last minute
sure.
takeaways for our audience?
My key, my key takeaways is are Pay attention to the regulations. Again, the risk with that's pushing all this is really privacy, AI regulations, and really over retaining data and information that you have to get rid of. So being on top of that, making sure your policy is up to date is very important. And the requirements and the pressure on the organization are going to increase, because I think you're going to start using systems that use AI at some level. So when these regulations come out, you're going to have to account for that. Ian?
Yeah, I'll just second what Omero said. I mean, the first and foremost for me and anything that you're doing in regards to information management is have those policies and procedures in place, know what they are, make sure they're being applied to your collections, so that as you move forward, you're fully compliant and you're not putting yourself in a position where you're potentially having to redo work or losing your return on investment on your initiative because you haven't taken those things into consideration.
Absolutely. And what about you, Kevin?
Well, it's been a great session today. Look, the landscape of information governance is changing as we speak. Staying compliant, of course, with changing regulations is always a challenge. Technology is changing and is a challenge. The expectations of what we do with information and how it feeds our world today in business and our lives is changing and is a challenge. So it's great to have these sessions from AIIM where we all get together and talk about these subjects in ways that really matter. And I want to thank both Ian and Omero for being a part of our event today and having some great perspective for us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our sponsor, Access, for a wonderful, informative webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us. This is Nina from AIIM saying, see you next time.